Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to APUSH. Today we're going to continue to discuss the changes that the Gilded Age brought to American society, looking at the transformation of American cities, the evolution of the way Americans feel about themselves, and some of the responses to these changes, both positive and negative. So today, urbanization and Taylorism and the effects. Here's your objectives for today, so take a moment to take them in, and we'll move forward. As we've talked about previously, urbanization increased substantially during this time period. We saw both people moving to cities as jobs in rural areas and opportunities dried up, as Black people moved out of the South, and as huge waves of new immigrants sought new opportunities in the United States because of both problems and warfare in Europe, but also the massive pull factor of the huge amounts of economic growth we were seeing. We start to see a shift between the urban and rural population, with them getting closer and closer together. By 1900, 60% of Americans still lived in rural areas, but a sizable portion of the US population was now living an urban lifestyle. And this necessitated a whole bunch of changes and challenges, as we talked about with urban political machines and some of our other lessons. So we see this massive growth in urbanization, which led to some pretty significant problems. One of the major crises coming out of this was the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, ostensibly or legendarily caused by old Mother Leary's cow kicking over a lantern in a shed. The fire ravaged the city of Chicago, both allowing for creating significant hardship, of course, but also allowing for significant opportunities to rebuild. And it led city planners to really reconsider the way they were designing modern cities, understanding that the sort of ad hoc method of pushing more and more people into these very tight urban quarters was not particularly efficient. And this is going to lead to some better designed cities, larger streets, so fire departments can get in to actually put out blazes like this, and general urban sprawl as cities start to expand outward, as it's understood that there's some significant dangers of just continuing to pack people into these urban environments. This is also going to lead to the evolution of the American dream. Going all the way back to the beginning of American history, the American dream was in general this sort of Jeffersonian idyllic yeoman farmer. You go out and you get some land and you build a house on that land and you're able to farm based on your own rugged individualism, moving up and being able to, improve your land a little bit and ensuring that you would have a decent life. This American dream defined the vast majority of American history, but as land in the frontier became increasingly either scarce or less agriculturally productive, we started to see an evolution of the American dream, pushing for a more urban lifestyle, moving from people like Jefferson Jefferson, James Madison, or Jackson from being the American economic ideal to people like Rockefeller and Carnegie. People, instead of wanting to go from farm boy to senator, instead wanted to be the next Rockefeller, Carnegie, or J.P. Morgan. And we got a significantly more urban American dream, moving into the middle class, working hard based on your own merit. And it creates, again, this sort of myth of rugged individualism, which to some degree was true, and of course to some degree was exaggerated, and a real sense of social Darwinism. This really shows up in the works of Horatio Alger, who sort of captured the oeuvre of this message with his hundreds of books with almost identical themes. Namely, some young kid moves to the city and then ends up succeeding through a combination of his own moral rectitude and hard work and luck. So here's Ragged Dick, or the street life in New York with the bootblacks. So take a moment, pause, and read, and we'll move on. This American dream that was sort of mythologized by Horatio Alger, you see here, strive and succeed, I'm assuming you can guess what that's about, emphasizes much more moving up this sort of urban ladder, moving up to the middle class, and having this separation between work and home, and having some opportunity for leisure activities. You can go out and watch the circus. Your only interaction with the West is through Buffalo Bill's Wild West shows. You see this sort of mythology built about the American West. And in general, this becomes a much more urban and industrial American dream. We also see the goal being to embrace and be able to purchase these new consumer products. The Singer sewing machine becomes sort of the ubiquitous consumer product during this time period. It was one of the first products to be mass marketed and advertised. And they also created the idea of paying with installments. The idea that a Singer sewing machine rep would come around and sell you a sewing machine, which you pay only a small amount down now, and then collect more payments as time goes on. So we start seeing the rise of consumer debt. Sewing machines made an ideal an ideal first sort of consumer debt product because as a durable good, if people didn't make their payments, it was very easy to show up and just retake the sewing machine and then sell it to someone else. So we see the beginning of American consumer debt. We also see the growth of mass marketing. For example, the Sears and Roebuck company started out marketing watches, mostly to train consumers, and then created this whole massive mail order empire where you could buy tables and shoes and fun, tonics to help out your toothache and whatever the heck this thing is. All of these products, the goal is to ostensibly to improve consumers' lives. And for the middle class, they were targeted mostly towards middle class workers who had the extra time to enjoy them and the extra money to pay for them. And so we're beginning to see the rise of consumerism in American society. We also see the rise of mass transit as during these years, cities get increasingly large. And so more and more people start living outside the city center, apart from their jobs. And so in order to help facilitate movement around cities, we get the beginning of the building of first elevated trains, streetcars, and then eventually subway systems as we begin to create this network within cities to help people move around effectively, to get to their jobs, to get to leisure activities, to get to these stores to purchase stuff, all of those various things. So all of that starts emerging during this time period. And this allows, of course, as we start building subways and things like that, we get the creation of suburbs. Suburbs are areas around the city center, generally used for residential housing. And once you can get on a streetcar or a subway and travel from the suburb into your job in the urban center, we start seeing the people who can afford to start to move out of urban centers, which of course is a long process that's going to create a whole series of problems as we go forward. We also see the growth of Frederick Taylor's scientific management. This is a way of scientifically looking at the workflow in factories and really trying to make the whole process much more efficient. It also builds in accountability and things and those type of things. So take a moment, read Taylor's Principles of Scientific Management here, and then we'll move on. The basic goal of Taylorism is to streamline the production process and make it more efficient by taking workers and putting them into a series of repetitive tasks, which they can then perform over and over again. This makes workers a more interchangeable cog in the whole manufacturing machine and makes it much easier to have workers doing more complex tasks, but also allows you to replace them more easily because all you have to do is train them to do this specific task, and then it fits into the whole system of production. The effect of this is pretty substantial. Quote, 100 men are now able to do what it took 300 or 400 men to do 15 years ago. But although this does lead to more efficiency, it doesn't necessarily lead to fewer jobs because we simply see businesses expand. They're going to build in management positions in order to provide accountability for these workers, bonuses to those managers for hitting production quotas. And in general, American work is going to become more efficient, and it's simply going to change the way that people work, not necessarily force people out. It's also going to create a larger divide between skilled and unskilled workers. Traditionally, skilled workers are workers who have special skills and training, whereas unskilled workers are people who can simply move in and do the job without a significant amount of training. Skilled workers, because it requires longer to train them, can generally demand higher wages than unskilled workers. And so what Taylorism is going to start doing is pushing out specific groups of skilled workers and making their jobs unskilled while creating other classes of skilled workers, generally educated managers and people who study production and workflow, things like that. The growth of economists and accountants and other jobs like that are going to replace the jobs of artisans and craftsmen and people like that. And so what's going to happen is the skilled workers are going to be pushed out of manufacturing in a lot of cases and are going to be moved into management, which allows, of course, you to hire other unskilled workers, including, of course, children, women, other groups of people who would previously not have been part of this production process. I mean, with the exception of Lowell Mills and things like that. So we're seeing a growth of certain types of skilled workers, a decrease in other types of skilled workers, and massive opportunities for unskilled workers and new immigrants. This is going to lead to issues with unionization because all of these three groups of people do not necessarily have the exact same goals. So, the National Labor Union was the first attempt to unionize everybody, and they tried to bring in skilled and unskilled workers, but were still racist against various groups of immigrants. They attempted to create a political party in the 70s. They were involved in excluding Chinese people, which we haven't talked about yet, but we'll get to with new nativism. And in the end, they failed because skilled and unskilled workers' interests do not necessarily align. And the things that unskilled workers do not like some often benefit skilled workers, and the things that skilled workers like do not benefit unskilled workers. And so in the end, the National Labor Union failed. The Knights of Labor was somewhat more effective, mostly due to the charisma and propaganda and, cool name. Its goals might have been unrealistic and vague, but decreasing work conditions in the 1970s and 1980s led to massive increases in membership of the Knights of Labor and the growth of sort of socialist groups. So here are some socialists who are advocating for this whole process. Take a moment, pause, take it in. Hopefully, you can note the increasing radicalism and the idea that all of these sort of European philosophies are coming in. The International Working Man's Organization has already been created. We've got Marx writing his stuff. We've got Bakunin writing his stuff. And so we're starting to see a lot of these European economic intellectual movements move into the United States. But the Knights of Labor were crushed in the Haymarket Affair. The Haymarket Affair was a rally for striking workers that ended up turning violent. Generally, there were a series of speeches. Police officers were there in order to make sure things didn't get out of control. This was in Haymarket Square in Chicago. And the Haymarket Riot. In the Haymarket Riot, an anarchist who was unassociated with the Knights of Labor threw a bomb, killing police officers. The police officers then opened fire, killing a lot of workers, and this led to the fatal discrediting of the Knights of Labor, as they were forever branded as too radical and too violent. So the Knights of Labor fell apart, and what replaced it was the AFL, which focused only on skilled workers, which were much easier to unionize. Because they had skills, their strikes were much more devastating. And so the skilled workers separated themselves out from the unskilled workers and were able to, in a lot of instances, successfully negotiate for better working conditions and higher pay. Whereas for unskilled workers, they were mostly left to their own devices, and conditions for them did not improve. So we saw a clear delineation between skilled and unskilled workers, with the lives of skilled workers improving and the lives of unskilled workers mostly staying the same. The lives of farmers were particularly bad during this time period. We talked about the sort of trap that farmers were stuck in, the cycle of increasing debt, where crop prices were falling because of increased cultivation. And so farmers, to make the same amount of money, had to buy new technology and get more land to produce more to make the same amount. But the more that farmers produced, the more crop prices fell. And so farmers became trapped in this fatal cycle, with small farmers really struggling to keep up, and even large farmers going into increasing amounts of debt to attempt to make the same amount of money. This led to a movement to help organize farmers to advocate for their interests called the Farmers Alliance. They held a series of picnics, held political rallies, speeches, things like that. And eventually, here's your Farmers' Declaration of Independence. Pause, take it in and read. Eventually, they're going to morph into a political movement called the Grange. The Grange movement is going to push for greater advocacy and awareness of farmers. They have somewhat broad political goals, including increasing the money supply in order to create inflation, creating savings banks for farmers, pushing for price increases, things like that. And so the Grange is going to create a bunch of propaganda to both help support this and to raise awareness of the fact that farmers are super important. And without farmers, American society collapses. So maybe we should pay more attention to them and pay more attention to their issues. It sort of worked, but for the most part, industrialists really didn't care about farmers and tried to paint the Grange as a series of political hayseeds who didn't really understand what they were talking about. And the other problem that we're going to keep running up against is the same things that help farmers often hurt workers. Farmers are harmed by low crop prices, but for workers, low crop prices mean cheap bread and cheap food. And for industrialists, cheap bread and cheap food means that they don't have to raise wages. So politicians are trapped in this incredibly difficult conundrum. Do they appease farmers by pushing for policies that would push for higher that would lead to higher crop prices and therefore higher revenues for farmers and harm workers? Or do they ignore the interests of farmers and instead appease the workers and industrialists by keeping crop prices low and hang farmers out to dry? There's not a really good middle ground here between these two groups. And so this is going to be a continuing political issue throughout the Gilded Age, pushing for, really at the heart of the currency reform issue. So that's our lesson for today. For next time, we're going to continue to talk about reform in the Gilded Age, the increasing work of unions in order to try to push back, pushing for better working conditions and a variety of other things, and generally trying to push American society forward. So that's for next time. For now, thank you for listening.